From New York, this is Democracy Now!
Israel will not tolerate this. I will not tolerate this. And as we speak, as I told you, Mr. President, just now, Israel is responding forcefully to this wanton aggression. I have a simple message to Israel's enemies. We will do whatever we must do to defend our people and defend our states.
Israeli warplanes have bombed Gaza for a third day in a row and mobilized dozens of tanks, raising fears of another Israel invasion. On Monday, a homemade rocket fired from Gaza hit an Israeli home north of Tel Aviv, injuring 7. This all came as Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu was at the White House Monday as President Trump signed a declaration officially recognizing Israel's control of the Golan Heights in defiance of international law. We'll get the latest. Then it's been a tragic week as 2 students who survived last year's school massacre in Parkland, Florida, died by suicide, as did the father of a child who was killed in the Sandy Hook school shooting in Connecticut. We'll speak to a leading psychiatrist who worked on a suicide prevention event in Parkland last year.
Suicide is a major public health crisis. It's a leading cause of death across the world, across ages. It's an incredibly prevalent and devastating public health issue.
All that and more coming up. Welcome to Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, the War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. Israel carried out a new wave of airstrikes in Gaza Monday in retaliation for a rocket Israeli authorities say was fired by Hamas, which destroyed a house near Tel Aviv and injured at least 7 people. The airstrikes, which injured at least 7 people in Gaza and destroyed several buildings, were met by additional rocket strikes from Gaza. An Egyptian brokered truce between Hamas and Israel was announced late Monday, but Gaza residents reported more explosions and a buildup of tanks by the separation barrier with Israel Tuesday. This is Gaza resident Yusuf Abu Shaban speaking among the wreckage of Monday's airstrikes.
I do not know what to tell you. Where are we supposed to go? Where are we supposed to live? Our children and families have become homeless. We do not know where to go anymore.
The escalating attacks came as President Trump officially recognized the Golan Heights as Israeli territory at a signing ceremony with Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu at the White House Monday. Trump announced the move last week by tweet, which reverses decades of U.S. policy and is in defiance of international law. Israel annexed the Golan Heights in 1981 after capturing the territory from Syria during the 1967 war. As President Trump and Republican lawmakers continue to celebrate Attorney General William Barr's summary of the special counsel's report, congressional Democrats are pushing for Robert Mueller's findings to be made fully available to the public, as well as to hold hearings with Barr. The long-anticipated report found the 2016 Trump campaign did not collude with Russia. The Attorney General also exonerated Trump from obstruction charges, although Mueller's report did not come to a definitive conclusion on the issue. Attorney General Barr is currently scheduled to appear before the House Appropriations Committee on April 9th for a budget hearing, but lawmakers may press him on the report. House Judiciary Chair Gerald Nadler is requesting the appearance at his committee as well. Meanwhile, Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell blocked a vote on a non-binding resolution to release the special counsel's full report, although President Trump declared it wouldn't bother him at all if the report was made public. Speaking to reporters, Trump suggested he might seek to pursue unnamed individuals for treasonous acts now that the Mueller probe is over.
There are a lot of people out there that have done some very, very evil things, very bad things, I would say treasonous things against our country. Those people will certainly be looked at. I've been looking at them for a long time, and I'm saying, why haven't they been looked at? They lied to Congress. Many of them, you know who they are.
The Pentagon has authorized the transfer of $1 billion to begin building a wall on the U.S.-Mexico border, over which Trump declared a national emergency. The first phase of funding will reportedly go toward 57 miles of 18-foot-high fencing along the Yuma and El Paso sections of the border. Democratic lawmakers immediately condemned the news, saying the administration did not go through the appropriate channels and request permission from the Senate Appropriations Committee to divert the money from military personnel funds. In a letter to Acting Defense Secretary Patrick Shanahan, Democratic senators on the committee wrote, quote, "We have serious concerns that the department has allowed political interference and pet projects to come ahead of many near-term critical readiness issues facing our military." The father of a 6-year-old girl who was killed in the 2012 mass shooting at Sandy Hook Elementary School, was found dead by apparent suicide Monday. Jeremy Richmond was a neuroscientist who, after the death of his daughter Avielle, devoted his life to finding solutions to brain abnormalities that lead to violence. He founded the Avielle Foundation to support brain science research with the ultimate goal of preventing violence and building compassion. Richmond's death follows 2 apparent suicides in the last week by survivors of the Parkland massacre in Florida. An unnamed student who survived last year's mass shooting at Marjorie Stoneman Douglas High School died by suicide Saturday. And 19-year-old Sydney Aiello, a former student and survivor from Parkland, died the previous weekend. Aiello suffered from post-traumatic stress disorder and survivor's guilt, according to her mother. We'll have more on preventing suicide with Columbia University professor Kelly Posner-Gerstenhaber later in the broadcast. You can reach the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline at 1-800-273-8255. That's 1-800-273-TALK. Survivors of the 2018 Parkland massacre and gun control activists gathered outside Congress in Washington, D.C. Monday to demand lawmakers pass the Background Check Expansion Act, which was introduced in January. 17 students, staff, and teachers were killed at Marjorie Stoneman Douglas High School February 14, 2018, in one of the deadliest school shootings in U.S. history. The action came 1 year after the historic March for Our Lives, which was inspired and led by students and took place in over 700 locations around the world. This is gun control activist, a survivor of the mass shooting, Emma Gonzalez, reading her message to lawmakers.
Dear Senator, every year 1,600 children across the country lose their lives due to gun violence. The fabric you hold in your hands represents 16 lives that you can save by voting yes on S-42. What will you do?
In more gun control news, the federal ban on bump stocks, accessories that turn semi-automatic rifles into fully automatic machine guns, is going into effect today, despite last-ditch efforts from so-called gun rights groups to appeal the new law. The Justice Department said Monday the Affordable Care Act should be fully overturned, reversing course from a previous position that primarily opposed the so-called health care penalty. In a filing with the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals, administration officials said they agreed with the ruling of a federal judge in Texas that declared President Obama's signature health plan unconstitutional last December. In the Mexican state of Sinaloa, local radio sports journalist Omar Ivan Camacho was found dead in an apparent homicide Sunday, making him at least the 5th reporter to be killed in Mexico so far this year. Protesters gathered to call for justice for the slain journalist. This is fellow reporter and activist Alejandro Siqueiros.
While there is insecurity, we are at a high risk, not just from criminals who attack us, but also from authorities who don't do their job. And there is a great indifference to journalists.
In Venezuela, a new power outage has hit over half the country, according to local reports. Venezuela's Vice President, Delcy Rodriguez, blamed the blackout on the opposition and their, quote, imperial masters in Washington, D.C. Power was restored in some parts of Venezuela by late Monday, including the capital, Caracas. But residents in other states said they're still in the dark. It comes less than 3 weeks after a massive power outage plunged most of Venezuela into darkness for days and reportedly resulted in at least 21 deaths. In Boston, 12 defendants in the elite college admissions scandal pleaded not guilty in a federal court Monday. The suspects include coaches and test administrators from some of the schools implicated in the scandal, including Georgetown, the University of Southern California, and Wake Forest. One of the suspects, a former tennis coach at Georgetown University, is accused of accepting over $2.7 million in bribes to get at least 12 students recruited to the school as tennis players, including students who did not actually play tennis. Defendants in the case face hefty fines and a maximum prison sentence of 20 years if found guilty. More defendants are expected to appear in court in the coming days. Meanwhile, Yale University rescinded the admission of a current student who applied to the Ivy League school with fabricated endorsements from a soccer coach. Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell is holding a vote on the Green New Deal today in what's being called a stunt vote designed to force Democrats to take a stand on a still divisive resolution that has no chance of passing in the Republican-controlled Senate. Democrats reportedly plan to block the move by voting present rather than for or against the resolution. Republicans have been spreading misinformation about the Green New Deal, while Democrats have accused them of failing to offer any solutions to the climate crisis. Democratic leadership has resisted backing the deal, although all 2020 hopefuls in congressional office have come out in support of it. New York Congressmember Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, who's become the political face of the Green New Deal and introduced its House version, blasted the move by Republicans, tweeting, "The GOP's whole game of wasting votes in Congress to target others on the record for legislation they have no intent to pass is a disgrace. Stop wasting the American people's time and learn to govern. Our jobs aren't for campaigning, and that's exactly what these bluff votes are for." Attorney Michael Avenatti was charged with extortion, bank fraud, and wire fraud in two separate cases Monday. In Los Angeles, Avenatti, who first came into the public spotlight as Stormy Daniels' lawyer in her hush money case against President Trump, was accused of embezzling $1.6 million from a California client and using it to pay for expenses related to his coffee shop business. Meanwhile, in New York, federal prosecutors accused Avenatti of attempting to extort Nike to the tune of over $20 million in what the Manhattan U.S. attorney called an old-fashioned shakedown. Avenatti allegedly threatened to reveal damaging information on improper payments made by Nike to student athletes unless they either paid him off or retained his services, unless Nike did. Avenatti, who was arrested and later released on bond, has denied the charges. Police in Escondido in Southern California are investigating a fire and acts of vandalism at a mosque as a possible hate crime. After fire crews were called to the Islamic Center of Escondido Sunday, they found graffiti referencing the recent mass murder in New Zealand, which was carried out by a white supremacist terrorist and killed 50 Muslim worshippers at two mosques. Police confirmed the reports have not revealed the contents of the graffiti messages or identified any suspects. Congregants were able to contain the blaze, and there are no reported injuries. The head of the local Council of American Islamic Relations, known as CARE, said in a statement, "While the majority of humanity has responded to the tragedy in New Zealand to draw closer to one another and refute hatred, a violent and hate-filled minority seeks further divisions. We stand in solidarity with our community members," CARE wrote. And in Mexico, President Andrés Manuel López Obrador is calling on Spain and the Vatican to apologize for the abuses of colonialism. AMLO released a video Monday speaking in front of the archaeological site of Comalcalco in the state of Tabasco.
Envié ya una carta al rey de España.
I sent a letter to the Spanish king and another letter to Pope Francis for an account of incidents and to ask for an apology to the First Peoples for the violations of what is now known as human rights. There were massacres, force, known as the Conquest. It was done with the sword and the cross. They raised churches on top of temples.
The government of Spain has rejected the request, saying events from 500 years ago, quote, cannot be judged in the light of contemporary considerations. And those are some of the headlines. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman.
And I'm Juan Gonzalez. Welcome to all of our listeners and viewers around the country and around the world. Israel has bombed Gaza for a third day in a row and mobilized dozens of tanks, raising fears that the Israeli government could launch another invasion. The latest airstrikes came earlier this morning after Hamas announced it had reached an Egyptian-brokered ceasefire with Israel. Tension has been escalating for days in Gaza. On Friday, Israeli soldiers shot dead 2 Palestinians taking part in the weekly Great March of Return protests. 62 other Palestinians were injured. On Sunday, Israeli air raids struck parts of Gaza, including a refugee camp. Then on Monday, militants inside Gaza launched a series of homemade rockets toward Israel. One of those rockets hit a house north of Tel Aviv, injuring 7 members of a British-Israeli family. Israel blamed Hamas for the rocket attack and retaliated by launching heavy airstrikes in Gaza City, targeting the office of Hamas's political leader and the group's military intelligence headquarters. 7 Palestinians were reportedly injured in the strikes.
This all occurred as Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu was in Washington Monday to meet with President Trump, who signed an order Monday officially recognizing Israel's control of the Golan Heights in defiance of international law. Netanyahu had been scheduled to address AIPAC, the American-Israel Public Affairs Committee, today, but cut short his trip due to the situation in Gaza and flew home. Speaking at the White House, Netanyahu defended Israel's use of force.
Israel will not tolerate this. I will not tolerate this. And as we speak, as I told you, Mr. President, just now, Israel is responding forcefully to this wanton aggression. I have a simple message to Israel's enemies. We will do whatever we must do to defend our people and defend our state.
The tension in Gaza comes as Netanyahu faces an uphill battle ahead of the Israeli elections April 9th, and as Hamas faces internal protests over recent tax increases and deteriorating living conditions. To talk more about the situation in Gaza, as well as the Golan Heights and other issues, we're joined by 2 guests. Jihad Abu Salim is a scholar and policy analyst from Gaza. He's joining us from Chicago, where he works on the Gaza Unlocked campaign run by the American Friends Service Committee. And in Jerusalem, Budour Hassan is with us. Budour is a Palestinian writer and project coordinator for the Jerusalem Center for Legal Aid and Human Rights. We welcome you both to Democracy Now! Budour Hassan, if you can start off by talking about what happened in Washington yesterday. President Trump signing just before the Israeli elections, in which the embattled prime minister is running, though the Attorney General of Israel says he'll be indicting him. The significance of the annexation of the Golan, of the U.S. recognizing the annexation.
Yeah, by recognizing Israel's sovereignty over the occupied Golan Heights, the United States has turned itself into a pariah state, blessing and glorifying the violation of human rights. It's obviously significant that after decades of refusing to recognize sovereignty, Donald Trump has given this massive election boost to Netanyahu by recognizing the sovereignty of the Golan Heights. And what's missing, though, Amy, from the coverage of the whole saga of recognizing the Golan Heights is no one actually is talking about the people of the Golan Heights, what they want and what they seek. And the people of the Syrian people in the Golan Heights have reiterated time and time again that their land is Syrian. It's not a disputed land. It's not a contested land. It's a Syrian land, and they have done everything in their power in order to defy Israel's attempts to Judaize their land. Since 1967, and especially since the annexation 1981, the people of the Golan have risen up several times against Israel's annexation. In 1982, actually in February 1982, they've waged a 5-month general strike and a civil disobedience campaign that would go on to inspire Palestinians during the First Intifada, stressing that they refused to hold Israeli identification card and that they refuse all attempts to erase their Syrian identity. Again, in 2018, 2018, last October, Israel tried to impose municipal elections in the Golan Heights as a gesture of its sovereignty over their territory. And again, Syrians in the occupied Golan Heights took to the streets en masse in order to oppose the holding electoral municipal elections in their lands, and stressing that they are Syrian. During these decades, only just 6% of the entire residents of the Golan Heights have applied for Israeli citizenship, meaning that the vast majority of people, the overwhelming majority of Syrians in the Golan Heights, recognize and identify themselves as Syrians. Again, despite Israel's imposition of a curriculum that tries to erase Syrian identity and replace it with an artificial Druze identity. We're talking about 27,000 people living, mainly Syrian, living in the occupied Golan Heights, who have been systematically discriminated against in terms of resources, whose resources have been exploited. We're also talking about 230,000 Syrians who've been displaced in 1967, more than 500,000 Syrian refugees from the Golan Heights who continue to be denied their right of return. We're talking about families that have been fragmented between the Golan Heights and Syria, and we're also talking about Israel continued exploitation of this resource-rich area and continued attempts to control and monopolize tourism and claim sovereignty over the territory. And Trump's move, recognizing and signing this executive order, gives blessing to these continued violations and erases an entire people off the map. One friend in the Golan Heights had told me that it's bizarre that a person who probably has never heard of the Golan Heights before that gives himself the right, entitles himself to acknowledge Israel's sovereignty over the Golan. It's neither Trump's to recognize this sovereignty, and it's neither Israel's to take. And this is we've seen this happen in Jerusalem last year when Israel moved its embassy, and except for a few rhetoric and few condemnation here and there, nothing actually happened. No punitive measures have been taken against the U.S. move to move its embassy to Jerusalem and to recognize Jerusalem as the capital of Israel. And if we only get rhetorics, the same will happen. And this is the danger. Obviously, people in the Golan will continue to resist and will continue to protest as they've always done. But this is an extremely dangerous step, and this signals that the United States, again, doesn't give any regard to human rights or to international law or to international humanitarian law.
I'd like to ask Jihad Abu Salim of the American Friends Service Committee's Gaza Unlocked campaign, your reaction to the president's announcement, and specifically how the international community has, because we've often heard much more about the Israeli occupations in the West Bank and prior occupations in Gaza, but very little about the Golan Heights. How has the international community dealt with the Golan Heights? And also, what's been the evolution of Israel's own policies toward the Golan Heights?
Thank you so much for having me. I think what's been happening in the Golan Heights is inseparable from Israel's broader policies of seizing Arab and Palestinian land and continuing to control these lands. And the Golan Heights, like the West Bank and the Gaza Strip, is a territory that have been the people there, like my colleague Budur said, their voices have been rendered unheard and silent over the years. I think President Trump's decision adds to the legacy of his administration and says much about the place of the occupation of Arab and Palestinian lands in the larger conversation in the U.S. today. This is a legacy of a president who separated refugee children on the border. This is a president who has been talking about building walls and separating people. This is a legacy of an administration that has been trying to separate people and divide them on the basis of their race and religion and so on. So by rushing to recognize Israel's sovereignty over the Golan Heights, President Trump gave Netanyahu a present as part of boosting him for the sake of the upcoming elections in Israel. But this moment says a lot about where the U.S. stands today and how do we view Israel, the United States' role in the region.
But where does the rest of the international community stand on this?
Well, unfortunately, we're living in a global moment where there is rise of right-wing populism. There has been a decline in the ability of the international community through the traditional institutions that have emerged after World War II to at least exercise the minimum. And the minimum here, we're talking about condemnation, we're talking about denouncing such steps. Unfortunately, the international community has been watching for a long time, and the inability of the international community to hold Israel accountable and to challenge the United States' negative role, not only when it comes to the Palestinian issue. The Palestinian issue and the occupation of the Golan Heights is part of a larger package of how the United States behaves in the Middle East and how it exercises its foreign policy and what considerations inform that policy. I think it's about time for us to think about and for the international community to think about taking serious steps to challenge this approach and to challenge the United States and Israel and to hold Israel accountable and to act beyond condemnation and issuing statements. For long, the international community has been issuing statements of condemnations, and now, the fewer countries are talking about what's going on in the Middle East and Palestine and Syria and so on. And I think this is the result of years and years of postponing the big issues and only highlighting certain aspects of the narrative and of the problem as it fit the discourses in the West. I think it's about time to go beyond these narratives and to challenge the negative role the U.S. has played and to hold Israel accountable.
Jihad Abu Salim, can you talk about what's happening in Gaza, where your family is? Can you talk about the, now 3 days of Israeli bombardment of Gaza? They're saying in response to a homemade rocket of Hamas, which hit Israeli home north of Tel Aviv and injured 7 people. Talk about the developments of the weekend.
Well, what's happening in Gaza and the rest of Palestine goes beyond the past 3 days. Israeli propaganda wants to show that Israeli actions in the Gaza Strip yesterday and in the past few days have happened as a response to Palestinian militants launching a rocket. I think limiting the discourse to talking about this incident limits our ability to understand how violence unfolds not only in the Gaza Strip but in all of Palestine. The Palestinian people in Gaza and beyond are victims to years and years of legal and structural violence that have been inflicted on them. And this violence that Israel exercises, Palestinians experience on a daily basis. We see the manifestations of this violence affecting Palestinian lives in the Gaza Strip. For example, the decade-long blockade that rendered the Gaza Strip unlivable. People living in Gaza with 4 to 6 hours of electricity a day. More than 90% of Gaza's water has been undrinkable and unpolluted, and people don't have access to clean water. We're talking about a Gaza Strip that with 2.2 million people, the majority of whom have never had the chance to travel and see the outside world. But it goes beyond Gaza. In the West Bank, Israel builds more settlements and seizes Palestinian land, and Palestinians in the West Bank have been subject to Israeli violence. Inside Israel itself, Palestinian citizens of Israel are victims to laws like the nation-state law that diminished any hope for them to enjoy any kind of self-determination, and made and affirmed that Israel is not a state for all of its citizens. Palestinians in the diaspora have been denied the right to return. So when we talk about violence, we're talking about decades and decades of violence that have been inflicted on Palestinians. And yes, in response to these years of violence, some Palestinians would resort to using some violent methods in response. But Israeli propaganda is trying to show that its actions are responses to some Palestinians resorting to violence, although it's their right to defend themselves according to international law and with accordance with international law. But again, it's important to remember that that what's happening in the Gaza Strip is part of that larger context of violence that Israel practices against the Palestinians, and it's important for us to remember and remember that in our narrative and in our discourse, because if we don't do so in the next few days or weeks, if Israel launches another 2014-like operation, thousands of Palestinians will lose their lives and many will be rendered homeless and injured.
And Badur Hassan, I wanted to ask you about the upcoming elections in Israel. I'm wondering if you could talk about the corruption allegations against Prime Minister Netanyahu, and also the whole issue of what will the Palestinian and Arab citizens of Israel who might be eligible to vote, what your sense is of what their role, if any, will be in these elections.
Okay, so first we'll talk about Palestinian citizens of Israel and their position from the elections and how we see the election, because I'm a Palestinian who carries an Israeli citizenship, and I personally am going to boycott these elections, as I have always done, because I believe that participating in these elections is only going to grant Israel legitimacy and is only going to promote its image as some sort of a democratic haven, when it is anything but. And many Palestinians, after having voted for the joint list in the previous elections and having tried that, they've also realized that this whole exercise of giving legitimacy to the sham Israeli democracy is futile, and they're going also to boycott, either from ideological reasons or from believing that this is just pointless. What we're seeing in the Israeli elections, the two main opposing parties, if we can call that opposing, is on the one hand we have Netanyahu and his far-right allies that they have been talking about and practicing annexation and violating the rights of Palestinians, and doing basically what all Israeli governments have been doing, right and left, but doing it in a naked fashion so as not to make it appear that they're different. But on the other hand, we have the so-called blue and white movement, which represents itself as some sort of a moderate opposition to Netanyahu. But the leader of this movement, Benny Gantz, is a warmongering. Just today, in response to the recent escalation in Gaza, he has called for targeted assassination. So this is the person who represents himself as a moderate. Even when he talks about ending, or when he talked about ending the occupation in part of the West Bank, he's only talking about that as to give Palestinians a sort of a sham state or sham control, not because he calls for liberating or because he wants an end to the occupation. So right now, among all main Israeli parties, there is not a single Zionist Israeli party that is actually serious about ending the occupation, that's serious about recognizing Palestinian rights. They're all faces of the same coin, regardless of where they sit on the spectrum, regardless whether they represent themselves as liberal or as conservative. And this is precisely why many of us Palestinians who carry Israeli citizenship are insistent that we won't participate in the elections, and we won't contribute to this erasure of our rights, because also we believe that we have other avenues to resist Israeli violations of our rights, especially on the streets, by taking to the streets and by popular resistance, not by participating in the parliament. Now, regarding the question of Netanyahu's upcoming or possible indictment, of course, we all know that there is a decision by the Israeli Attorney General to indict Netanyahu on one case of bribery charges and on breach of trust charges pending a hearing. And instead of trying to defend himself, Netanyahu has exploited this possible indictment in order to even further promote his image and represent it as a sort of a conspiracy by the left against him. So he's kind of using all his populist cause in order to prove that he's the one who's being attacked by the judiciary, by the so-called left that he represents as left. So he's kind of trying to use this move, and especially after Trump's recent declaration of the occupied Golan Heights as being acknowledging Israel's sovereignty over it, Netanyahu is just using every card that he has in order to win elections for another time. But again, regardless of what will happen after the indictment, if there will be an indictment, it's obviously very clear now that Netanyahu is immersed in corruption. But the thing is, even if he is held accountable, or if he's held accountable, he will only be held accountable in a very small portion, because there are other crimes besides corruption that no one's talking about. We're now marking a year to the March of Return protests. There have been almost 200 Palestinians who've been murdered, unarmed Palestinians who've been murdered in these protests. There are 7,000 wounded Palestinians, and no one's talking about holding Netanyahu and his government accountable. There is this tendency among the liberal Israeli elite to just talk about violations when it comes to corruption, but no one among all of them is talking about the violations that the military, on the behest of Netanyahu, has committed. And this is precisely why, again, I think that many Palestinians within the Green Line have reached this conclusion that after decades of Israeli colonialism and of Israeli expansion and of continued violations and the escalation of racist laws that have always been the norm in Israel since 1948, it's time to change our strategy. Instead of giving this legitimacy to Israel, it's time to remove this leaf of legitimacy and kind of adopt other strategies in our resistance to Israeli colonialism.
Budur Hassan, I want to thank you for being with us, Palestinian writer and project coordinator for the Jerusalem Center for Legal Aid and Human Rights, speaking to us from Jerusalem. And thank you to Jihad Abu Salim, a scholar and policy analyst from Gaza. He runs the Gaza Unlocked campaign for the American Friends Service Committee, speaking to us from Chicago. This is Democracy Now! When we come back, in the last week, 3 suicides related to mass shootings. 2 survivors of the Parkland massacre, a young man and a young woman, took their own lives. And then just yesterday morning, the father of a victim of the Sandy Hook massacre killed himself. We'll speak with a leading psychologist on suicide prevention. Stay with us.
فكرك الجيل الثالث يطلع إسرائيلي أخي الوقت بينسيش بل بالعكس بيزيد تاريخ
سكون بدناش عم كف بدناش شروح حدود بدناش
فكرك الجيل الثالث يطلع إسرائيلي أخي الوقت بينسيش بل بالعكس بيزيد تاريخ
سكون بدناش عم كف بدناش شروح حدود بدناش جاي أعمل خطاب راب واحكي عن اللي راح جاي أعمل اضرب بالراب احتلال الأرض الفلاح جند بطول وعرض متخبي ورا الساحة فلسطين فاتح حكومة إرهاب وإحنا ندور على المفتاح بصوتهم مسموع عشان اليوم الصف مزروع بقلوب الناس موجود بالعول محدود مربوط فكرة إن إحنا شعب محروم جرب هقوم بس لا الطريق مسدود بلا ما يكون مفهوم إنه محكوم من حكام اللي تدوم عشان أطفالنا تموت وإحنا نقول قضاء وقدر بس كتنا بزيد الخطر والله سطر في جزء عنده وعي سياسي وناديكم تعالوا معي قبل ما تزيد على عميد وراء النعي أمان والله حماني إنساني مش تعباني زي باقي الناس لا بتحكي لا بتسمع بس مهما الزمن دار الوطن رح يرجع
فكرك الجيل الثالث يطلع إسرائيلي أخي الوقت بينسيش بل بالعكس بيزيد تاريخ
سكون بدناش عم كف بدناش شروح حدود بدناش
فكرك الجيل الثالث يطلع إسرائيلي أخي الوقت بنسيش بل بالعكس بيزيد تاريخ
سكون بدناش نظام كف بدناش شو محدود بدناش شو تحكي لجواتي لا الراب هو ذاتي ساعدنا واقف على حق وعلى حق إخواتي بهالبلاد.
Third Generation by Damar. This is Democracy Now! I'm Amy Goodman with Juan Gonzalez.
We turn now to the public health crisis of suicide. The father of a 6-year-old girl who was killed in the 2012 mass shooting at Sandy Hook Elementary School was found dead by a parent's suicide Monday. Jeremy Richmond was a neuroscientist who, after the death of his daughter Avielle, devoted his life to finding solutions to brain abnormalities that lead to violence. He founded the Avielle Foundation to support brain science research with the ultimate goal of preventing violence and building compassion. This is Jeremy Richmond speaking in 2013.
We need to face and take action on hard issues. There is not going to be one simple solution, but we feel it is essential to get a deeper understanding of mental health in terms of research, education, and policy.
That was Jeremy Richmond, the Sandy Hook father who took his own life yesterday. The news of his death came just days after 2 students who survived last year's shooting massacre at Marjorie Stoneman Douglas High School in Parkland, Florida, died by suicide. An unnamed student died Saturday, according to local authorities, and 19-year-old Sydney Aiello died last weekend. Aiello suffered from post-traumatic stress disorder and survivor's guilt, according to her mother. 17 students, staff, and teachers were killed in Parkland on February 14, 2018, in one of the deadliest school shootings in U.S. history.
David Hogg, a Parkland massacre survivor and gun control activist, tweeted Sunday, "How many more kids have to be taken from us as a result of suicide for the government school district to do anything? R.I.P. Rest in peace, 17 plus 2. And this is Ryan Petty, whose daughter Elena died in the Parkland shooting, speaking to CNN on Monday.
I think parents are wanting answers. They got a lot of questions, and they're wondering, could this be my son or daughter? And so what we talked about yesterday in our emergency meeting was we really need to drive awareness. We need to make sure that everyone in the community, especially parents, understand that their child may be at risk or their loved one may be at risk. And so we wanted to drive that awareness, not to scare them or to create more concern, but to make sure that they understand what to look for. And then we wanted to equip those parents with the right questions to ask. So we want to drive awareness, but make sure they have the right questions and the knowledge to determine whether or not their child's at risk.
Suicide rates are continuing to rise in the United States. A report out last year by the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention found the U.S. suicide rate increased by 25% over the past 2 decades. Topping the list was North Dakota, where suicides rose by 57% from 1999 levels. Suicide is now the 10th leading cause of death in the United States. The report found that nearly 45,000 suicides occurred in the country in 2016, more than twice the number of homicides. Firearms accounted for 51% of all suicides in the same year. Among people aged 15 to 34, suicide was the second leading cause of death.
If you or someone you know may be considering suicide, contact the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline at 1-800-273-TALK. That's 1-800-273-8255. We're joined right now by Dr. Kelly Posner-Gerstenhaber. She's a professor of psychiatry at Columbia University, founder and director of the Columbia Lighthouse Project. Last year, she worked on a suicide prevention event in Parkland. Her recent article for the Miami Herald headlined, "To help prevent suicide, all we have to do is ask." Dr. Kelly Posner-Gerstenhaber, thanks so much for being with us. Can you first respond to what happened this weekend? Because you spent time in Parkland advising people after the massacre. You feared exactly this would happen.
Well, Let me start with the good news, because I think we all need a little bit of that. You know, suicide is preventable, and there is help out there for people suffering. But you started to say how this is one of the world's greatest public health crises. Let me reinforce that for a minute. You know, #1 cause of death in adolescent girls across the globe, takes more lives than car accidents, more firemen than fire, more police than crime, and 135 people are affected for every death, and those effects linger across generations because of the silence that often follows. And so I said, we can actually save these lives. What do we know we need to do? Did you know that 50% of suicides see their primary care doctor the month before they die? We need to be asking the way we monitor for blood pressure. Many adolescents who show up to the emergency department who've tried to take their own lives are not there for psychiatric reasons. But we know that even that's not enough in terms of finding the people suffering in silence. You know, the undersecretary wrote this urgent memo that we must go beyond the doctor's office with something called the Columbia Protocol that Ryan Petty was talking about, giving to every parent in the community. We need to find people where they live, teachers, coaches, peers, before they ever, if they ever get to a doctor, so we can better identify the people who need help and connect them to that care that they need. Because you know what? When people are suffering, they actually want help. My colleague who survived jumping off the Golden Gate Bridge said people who are suicidal want to be saved. What we need is a culture where no one is afraid to ask, so we can find them and get them that help. And what's really empowering is that there are things we can do. And that's what we started talking about last year, and that's what Ryan Petty and Parkland have been talking about every day now. We need to equip the community, and these few simple questions are a way that everybody can be part of the solution.
Talk about what those questions are.
So it's a few simple questions that identifies suicidal thinking and suicidal behavior for the first time. And what does that mean? We used to just ask about a suicide attempt, and then you miss the person that bought the gun or wrote the note or collected the pills, things we absolutely cannot afford to miss. And it's the first time we know the right questions to figure out whose thoughts actually indicate imminent risk. And you know what? It also has a connection to prevention of gun violence, which is how I first got together with Parkland and many other communities. Did you know 90% of shooters have suicidal issues? So if we ask a few questions, we might be able to find people who need help before it's too late, you know, early identification. So these simple questions to connect the right people to care have many, many positive outcomes.
And in your experience, given this exploding suicide rate in the country, especially among young people, what do you think is sparking or causing this? Is there a general growth? There's been a growth of anxiety among young people, especially. But your sense of what are the underlying causes of this increase?
Well, let me be clear. It's been a very slow and steady rise, about 1% a year over the last 30 years. Now, recently, it's been, you know, slightly higher than that. But this has been a problem, and you know, a massive, massive problem. You know, the biggest cause of suicide is a treatable medical illness called depression. But we don't think of depression like we think of cancer. You wouldn't hear the word choice when it comes to cancer. Did you know depression is the #1 cause of global disability, costs humanity more than anything? And guess what? Because people don't think of this like a medical illness, snap out of it, I'm weak if I ask for help, it prevents them from actually getting the life-saving medications and care and treatment that they need. So we very much have to break down barriers of stigma and misunderstanding so we can identify people suffering in silence and connect them to the care they need. We know that not treating depression is actually what kills people.
And we're going to get to those questions. What you ask someone, does it have to be a professional asking? Can it be a friend asking? In 30 seconds, because we're going to break now. We're speaking to Dr. Kelly Posner Gerstenhaber, professor of psychiatry at Columbia University, founder and director of the Columbia Lighthouse Project. Stay with us. parts by John Frusciante. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman with Juan Gonzalez. Our guest is Dr. Kelly Posner Gerstenhaber, professor of psychiatry at Columbia University. Dr. Gerstenhaber, you are the principal author of the Columbia Protocol. What is it? What are the questions that need to be asked?
So these few simple questions that can and should be in everybody's hands go as follows. It starts with, have you wished you were dead? Or go to sleep and not wake up? Or have you actually had thoughts of killing yourself? And if that's yes, have you thought about how you might do this? Have you had these thoughts and had some intention of acting on them? Or have you started to work out or worked out the details of how to kill yourself? Do you intend to carry out this plan? And then, have you ever done anything, started to do anything, or prepared to do anything to end your life, like collecting pills, writing a note, buying a gun? And we know if they say, I had some intention to act on these thoughts, that's when risk goes up 50%, and we know somebody's at more imminent risk and needs help. Also, if they had any of those behaviors, things we were never asking about before.
But when do parents or loved ones or friends ask this question? Because obviously there's a reluctance to even broach the subject.
There is, and that's what people need to understand. When people are suffering, they actually want to be asked. And in the past, friends or parents didn't know what questions to ask. They didn't know what to do with the answers, and they didn't know if somebody wanted to be asked. So now we have the tools. Every set of these questions comes with the next steps, and the most important thing you can, when you think something's just not right, or somebody looks like they're not themselves, ask the questions. Now, if you go into the primary care office, you'll get it like blood pressure. But here, every family member, every community member, every loved one, every teacher can actually have a set of questions that they can use if they feel it would be helpful.
But so often at a very difficult time, a person either goes into a shell, becomes less communicative, or the opposite, much more aggressive, alienating people. It seems to be the most difficult time to ask questions like these.
Well, I think that that's not what we find. You know, when people are suffering in silence and they're feeling depressed, they actually want to be asked. And we often assume that they're going to have the will to come to us. And they often don't. That's why we need to come to them. And again, when people are suffering, they want to feel better. They just don't know that they can. So it's to connect them and identify that pain they're going through. And very often, you know, depression actually does present like that. Aggression, irritability, and it's all can be a symptom of exactly the same thing. And again, the more we ask, the more we identify suicidal feelings directly, the more we're going to help people get the treatment they need to save their lives and reduce this terrible suffering. And the beautiful part of this, or one of the positive outcomes, is that now the community can be engaged in something positive and meaningful that can actually help save lives and prevent these terrible tragedies we're dealing with again in the last few days.
I want to ask you, in the last couple of months, there were 2 Stanford University students who died by suicide. One of them was an athlete who had won a silver medal with her cycling team at the 2016 Olympic Games. Are there any particular groups of young people that might be subjected to more pressures that might get them to think of suicide? For instance, I'm thinking of athletes in particular that you've dealt with.
Not really. This is the biggest cause, is this medical illness called depression, right? And it's the second leading cause of death in 10 to 24-year-olds. But your point is an important one. You know, Princeton came to me first. Let's give these questions to the athletic coaches, to the resident advisors. So the point is, everybody suffers and is at high risk for depression and for suicide. But how do we find them and connect them? So putting these questions in the hands of the coach and the teacher and the peer is really, really important. This isn't about, you know, pressure or being at a school where academic pressure is bad or is increased, or you know, you're an athlete and you have more pressure because of those demands. It's really because of this, you know, the biggest cause, again, is this medical illness that we suffer from, and we need to identify
And
people.
what do you say to schools for how they should deal with this? Like, for example, Juan just mentioned the 2 Stanford students, one after the other in the same division in math and engineering, grad students, one in her dorm room, the other in his lab. What should schools do? And are kids afraid of coming forward, young people, students, that they might be thrown out of a school because they don't want to sully their reputation? The school wants to make sure someone like this doesn't wreck their record.
Yes, students are afraid to speak out and get help because of all of that stigma, where we don't think of this like any other medical illness. What schools can do is screen as much as they can, arm people with the way to identify people. You know, college presidents worry very much about the liability of suicide. You know, a history of a suicide attempt is the #1 risk factor when they come in for their health screens. Ask a few questions, find people who, you know, who need ongoing monitoring, et cetera. When we start to treat this like any other illness, like asthma, you know, like blood pressure, et cetera, we will break down those barriers and get kids the help that they need.
And what about the situations, for instance, the 2 students from Parkland, those who survive mass shootings? There's generally immediate grief counseling provided by the schools, but this now happens a year later. What kind of ongoing support is necessary for young people who survive mass shootings?
Yeah, so long-term outcomes for survivors of shootings are really improved with community connections and continuing access to mental health treatment. So, and empowering them with, particularly with student and community efforts. And in the short term, we know that medications help very much with anxiety reduction, and PTSD is a form of anxiety. We know that there are skills that can be given, and you know, mechanisms in addition to medication that will continue to reinforce thinking and writing and talking about the traumas that they've gone through.
Sydney Aiello's mom, the 19-year-old young woman, survivor of the massacre who just took her own life last weekend, she said she suffered from PTSD and from survivor's guilt. What does that mean, and what did you find when you went to Parkland and talking to students and family members?
Well, I originally went to Parkland to work with the community to help them start to figure out how to identify and put the Columbia Protocol in people's hands. But what we know is that survival guilt has long been connected to PTSD after lots of traumatic incidents like Holocaust, combat survivors. You know, and we know that, again, when you add that on top of a baseline mental health issue like depression or anxiety, the risk just goes up even farther. And people don't know how to deal with the distorted beliefs that they have from the PTSD. You know, perceived responsibility. They could have done something. You know, et cetera. So we really need to get at, you know, helping give them the tools to address the trauma that they're dealing with, probably on top of other anxieties and depression after these terrible incidents.
And what is the medical community, in your view, not doing? And I would include in the medical community the insurance companies that have a lot to say over what kind of treatment people get in terms of dealing with these mental health issues.
I think one of the most important things that we're dealing with as a society and the medical community, the biggest barrier to effective treatment is stigma. You know that since we have antidepressants, for example, the suicide rate has dropped dramatically across the world, across ages, reversing a trend prior to their introduction. However, 50 to 75% of people who need those medications do not get them, because of stigma and people not wanting to access treatment because they don't think of this like any other medical illness.
We're going to ask you to stay with us, and we're going to post online part 2 of this discussion. We want to ask you about veterans, also to talk to you about just every day in workplaces, how things should be identified when people don't want to be, telling on someone, ratting out someone, but deeply concerned about someone's behavior and feelings. Dr. Kelly Posner-Gerstenhaber, professor of psychiatry at Columbia University, founder and director of the Columbia Lighthouse Project. If you or someone may be considering suicide, contact the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline at 1-800-273-TALK. I'm Amy Goodman with Juan Gonzalez.